I want to circle back to something we talked about last week. And because we had a lot of material, and we talked a little bit about different kinds of ethical commands in Scripture. And if you remember the triangle, we talked about immediate judgments we might make, and then rules kind of guiding us in that, but then underlined by principles that kind of explain why rules exist. And then at the very bottom, the basic convictions that really define our worldview, and how those upper levels are grounded in deeper layers, so that you can always ask somebody the why question, right? Or ask yourself, why do I think this? Or why would I do this or not do that? And you can give an answer. Then you say, okay, well, why that? And eventually you get to that basic conviction level of worldview. And the worldview thing as a Christian really largely comes out of the things that God tells us. And that's not a long, long list. Like at that level, it's big, big things like, God is one and God is triune, and Jesus is Lord, and we fall short and are sinners and need redemption. And big things like that, major things that define our understanding of God or understanding of ourselves. But then the details get worked out as we go. I just want to go back to that because we talked a little bit about how that works. And I gave one example that related to 1 Peter and working through what Peter says about men and women living together in the New Testament. And I know there was another question last week. Jens brought up the issue of sexual relationships in the church, LGBTQ, same-sex relationships, and things like that. And I just want to come back and just suggest how that might plug into this. Now, those are big, big issues. And so I'm somewhat hesitant to do that because usually I would say, you know what, we need a whole other course to talk about sexual ethics. It's something I've been thinking of doing, actually. But I can speak about it a little bit, realizing that it's a much, much bigger issue. And this might be just one little slice of raising questions about it. There are many sides to that issue. And there's also like truth-related issues, and then there's pastoral and compassion and care-related issues, and they have to be looked at carefully. But sometimes when you go through looking at biblical interpretation, people sometimes suddenly become aware that things are more complicated than they thought. And this can be a little bit disturbing. Sometimes people can get the sense that, oh my goodness, there's so much there to consider. And then they might also fear, like, okay, if I begin to ask interpretive questions, and let's say I move from like a complementarian position of, men only in leadership in the church, and I accept egalitarianism, is that going to just create a slippery slope where I just kind of go liberal on every issue conceivable? And sometimes we see kind of people doing that as they move from one camp to another. It's like one or two issues they change their minds on, and then it's like everything else sort of lines up. And I think I would just say we need to be careful of that, and also of being afraid of that, because every issue really is its own issue. And you have to look at every issue on its own. So anyways, I just want to come back to that and remind you kind of what happened and see how this compares to the issue of something like same-sex relationships in the church, knowing that it's actually a much bigger discussion, and this doesn't resolve that really here. So we talked about Peter's instructions, where he says, wives, submit to your husbands. And then we noticed that that was actually grounded in an underlying principle, which is live admirably amongst the Gentiles for the sake of the gospel. You have to back up to see that, and then you read everything that follows in context of that. That in turn, we might say, rests on some basic convictions around the creation of human beings, their fallenness, and so male-female relationships are going to be difficult. There's going to be issues and problems arising, but also basic convictions about the call to mission, right? Live admirably amongst the Gentiles. We're called to win people for Christ, in a sense, right? And then maybe things like Christ is Lord, right? Because we're going to submit ourselves to each other because we are showing reverence to Christ as Lord. So working our way back up again, submitting to husbands, the judgment that immediately might be made by a woman in the church in Peter's day might be, I'm going to defer to my husband in order to keep all of this intact and be faithful to Christ. In a different kind of context, though, I suggested that sometimes, in order to serve the principle, the rule might actually have to change. So I gave that example about, giving women advice that they need to wear long skirts and saying how very different that would be in the context of, let's say, a classroom versus a mission field where we're going into a very, traditional tribal setting, maybe let's say in Africa or something. And so the rule I'm giving is wear a skirt, but really what I'm saying is the principle, which is dress appropriately so as not to cause offense and to dress like one of the locals, basically, right? So that's why rules sometimes need to change in order to honor the principle. Or in other words, our rules need to follow the spirit and not just the letter, is another way we might put it. So notice that the basic convictions don't change. The principles still apply. But today we might need to rephrase the question to ask, okay, if we're going to apply this analogously in our setting in a way that helps us to live admirably amongst the Gentiles as men and women, the question might be, how ought married couples to do this fittingly in the 21st century? And if you're an egalitarian, you might say, well, I think actually being equal partners in marriage and in ministry is the best way to do this. It honors this rule, which honors the principle, which is still in line with the basic convictions. Now, I know not everybody is an egalitarian necessarily and might differ. I'm just trying to show how changing that aspect doesn't kind of throw the whole system off, you might say. It doesn't it challenges how we apply scriptural principles, but it doesn't actually alter the principle itself or the basic conviction at the lower level. So what about something like same-sex relations? Well, I'm going to say it doesn't necessarily work out the same way. Now, there's a big conversation to be had, as I keep saying, about all the complicated issues and interpreting the Bible and all that stuff. But just kind of for argument's sake, there's a rule in Scripture that rules out same-sex relationships. It comes up in the Old Testament, places like Leviticus 18 and 20. It comes up in the New Testament, in Romans 1, in 1 Timothy, in Ephesians, several other places. Not tons of places, but maybe there's 7 or 8 texts that kind of state this rule and then back it up in various ways, where same-sex relationships seemingly are ruled out. So the question we would ask is, well, why? Why would the Bible do that? Why would, Paul in Romans, or why would, Leviticus, why would this in Timothy, why would same-sex relationships be ruled out? And traditionally, at least, as the church has interpreted the Bible, it goes back to a principle, which first of all would be sexual fidelity within marriage. That's what we're called to. So if we're going to talk to people who are in sexual relationships, we would say sexual fidelity within marriage and chastity outside of marriage. Okay, that's still not clear enough to talk about why the rule's there, but it's still a constraining set of principles for the rule. And then if we were to ask, okay, well, let's push further, then we would rub up against some basic convictions that are deep and underlying that would suggest that God's creation design includes the sexual complementarity of male and female. Not the role complementarity necessarily, but that as sex bodies, they are made one for the other, and that God says this is good and it's his will and its intention. And if you understand that, then the various prohibitions kind of make sense in light of that. And in fact, some have said Scripture is so consistent on this that you wouldn't even need the prohibitions, really, because from Genesis to Revelation, you just have this sexual complementarity as the assumption throughout Scripture. And then we would have some basic convictions that would speak to us about sexual brokenness, distortion, of all of us experience our sexuality in light of the fall. So sex is broken. And so we would expect from a scriptural point of view to see that sometimes our sexual desires don't fall into God's intentions for them necessarily. So then the immediate judgment within this would be, well, not to eliminate desire, but to redirect desire. I say not to eliminate because approaches to try to suppress same-sex attraction have not seemed to work out very well, to say the least. But to redirect desire, to channel desire into serving God, to serving his kingdom, And there are a number of gay Christians that find ways to do that in a variety of ways, which we won't get into now. Okay, so what happens though if we were to change the rule here? So let's change the rule and say, okay, what if we're going to affirm and bless and celebrate same-sex relationships? Well, the outcome of that, in terms of how we would apply it, would be not just a sort of sexual free-for-all, but what many gay Christians are arguing for is, an affirmation of what they call lifelong covenantal, exclusive, monogamous unions between same-sex couples. So that would be a way that the rule would be put into place. So it's not just free-for-all, but it's still a rule-governed life, and it would be governed around lifelong covenantal same-sex unions. We could go down deeper, and actually the principles could still apply. So, many people will say, lots of gay couples experience virtue, like they experience intimacy, and there's goodness, and there are many good things that could be had in that relationship. And there's no really reason to deny that. That's true. You could still have sexual fidelity within the marriage. You could still have chastity outside of marriage, and the principles hold together. But where this breaks down is with the basic convictions. We would have to say that God's creation design is either irrelevant, and sometimes people they'll say, well, the Old Testament doesn't really count, but they don't notice how the New also refers back to it sometimes. Or we have to say that God's creational design is something different. Like we would have to say that God's creational design just has to do with two people committing to each other. And the sexes are basically interchangeable. It doesn't really need to be male and female. And some people do attempt to argue that, and then it becomes a question of, well, how would you know what God's will is, and what does Scripture tell us about that? It becomes a discussion about that, really. And then we would have different ideas maybe here about what sexual brokenness looks like, because people will say same-sex relationships are ruled out in the Bible, not because they're against God's will as such, but because certain forms of same-sex relationships are unhealthy, like abusive ones, or relationships of pederasty, where men are having relations with boys or something like that, or temple prostitution. So then it would become a matter of saying, well, is this what's really going on or not? But this is where we would have a problem, because we are not just at liberty to change basic convictions, because they're basic. It's that bottom layer where you've really reached, there's no further why. It's kind of like, well, God told us so, right? He made men and women to be for each other, and that's just a basic conviction that's revealed in Scripture. And there's no why behind that, because that would be implying that there's some authoritative source beyond what God says, but there isn't, right? So again, there are interpretive issues, but that's how that one would potentially play out according to a traditional view. So I just show this to say that it's not necessarily a slippery slope to rethink the application of rules in Scripture. I can also show this by means of William Webb's redemptive movement hermeneutic. We talked about this too, where sometimes what happens is that there's movement as you move from the ancient culture's treatment of an issue to the Old Testament, and there's a redemptive movement. And then when you move to Old Testament to New Testament, there's a further redemptive movement. And then you have a kind of trajectory established where you might posit an ultimate ethic that we're still trying to reach. And so Webb argues that this is the case on the women in ministry issue, and he argues that it's the case on the slavery issue. He's also made similar arguments with respect to corporal punishment or spanking, and also the issue of war and peace. There's a variety of other issues, I argued, that you could see this kind of thing working out with, like democratic forms of government, right? Or business and accounting ethics, or just more realized ethics that we've achieved today, like abolition of slavery or human rights and things like that. But again, with the issue of same-sex relationships, Webb says that the trajectory doesn't move the same way, because the ancient culture is actually more free and open with sexuality. That's a bit more of a free-for-all. And moving from the ancient culture to the Old Testament was actually a restrictive move. to say you can't actually do these things. So the Old Testament was very much a countercultural text in that sense. And then moving from the Old to the New, there's just no movement at all. It doesn't go up or down. It just remains consistent because, Jesus quotes Genesis when he talks about marriage to say that, well, read about how it was in the beginning. And this instructs us in terms of now. And then, of course, we have the other New Testament texts that refer back as well. So we don't really have an upward trajectory. We have a kind of static trajectory, you might say, or a flat trajectory. So again, I don't say that to try to resolve that issue. That would be a much bigger conversation. I just, again, am saying we're not necessarily on a slippery slope when we begin to think through how ethical reasoning works.